Value Impulses, the podcast for potential development, by and with Uli Vogel. A very warm welcome, dear listeners, to today's episode of Value Impulses, the podcast for potential development. And today I have a very, very special guest joining us. It's Christoph Meier, whom I've known since 2009 from Switzerland, more specifically from St. Gallen. Welcome, Christoph. It's great to have you here. Thanks. Hello.
Thanks, Uli. Glad to be your guest today. Let's go.
Let's go, exactly. And yeah, starting a bit with some memories, looking back to 2012, 13 I think it was, so definitely over 10 years ago, we were already connected professionally. You were using profiling values, you were moving your Outvision forward. We held a conference in Munich. And then you brought your first daughter and your wife along, Svea. And that was a very, very touching, beautiful experience for me. And yeah, before that we did the training for the first time in Switzerland. And you took part in that too and have been, well, a pillar for us in Switzerland ever since. But you have a very, very interesting background, and especially the topics you work on, I find highly relevant today, and so maybe I'll just bring in the title of the episode again. From you, before you introduce yourself. You said, identify, live, and integrate values. Lead and develop successfully. I think those build on each other very well and make sense, but I think it's necessary that we explain that clearly to our listeners today. But now let's go back a bit so that people can get an idea. Who is Christoph? Where does he come from? And yeah, why is he where he is today?
Yeah. It really has been a long time, 2009, when we started together. I started my own business with Outvision in 2008. I always say back then I was young and naive and I wanted to start my own business. Before that I was a teacher, worked as an educator, did a lot of outdoor work with young people, experiential education. And I had too little freedom in the school and then thought, maybe it would be better if I were a principal. So I did some training, a master's degree in organizational development and coaching supervision. And during those studies I decided that being a principal wouldn't be right for me either, as the structures can be even more restrictive. I'll try my own thing and had the idea of helping people and companies find the right positions within organizations, and above all, helping companies select the right people. And during my training, I already came across various diagnostic tools, and they totally fascinated me. I tried out everything I could get my hands on, including in customer projects, employee surveys, and so on. And then, relatively soon, I also got in touch with you and was impressed by the values diagnostics. I really wanted to get to know it better, to understand it, and I signed up with you quite spontaneously. I think it was the first certification in Switzerland where you personally taught us profiling values.
Exactly, yes. I can still remember it well. It was in St. Gallen, actually. And you've always been an advocate. You just said, everything you can get your hands on. You also have another certification that you use. I'm always a fan of plurality. There isn't one single method that somehow does it all. If I remember correctly, you also do something with the HR cockpit. Or maybe you can briefly tell our listeners what your diagnostic mix is like.
We actually work with HR diagnostics and profiling values in combination, and we are, as far as I know, the only ones using this combination. HR Cockpit was developed by a Swissman, Jörg Hilber, and I've been in contact with him since a year earlier. I think it was already 2008, for employee surveys. And then he developed this skills analysis around the year 11. And that one fascinated me too. I was able to provide various inputs there, and I was able to develop with him what else we needed. The idea, of course, was to have an additional tool alongside profiling values that asks even more, and the cool thing about it for me is simply the perception that profiling values measures potential very deeply, what's inside a person in terms of values and personality, and the skills analysis gets straight to the point. And in combination, you can see if they fit together, if the picture is consistent. And that makes it extremely exciting. And that's how you really find out a lot about the people being analyzed.
Nice. I've often admired you for that over the past years, because you created such a combination and then really focused for a long time on online assessments and recruitment. I've always felt like I have a bit of a mixed bag myself and I'm out there with all sorts of things. But we've had many conversations, always made it analytically very clear where you want to go, what exactly the point is, and how can I sharpen it, hone it, and then achieve a positioning in the market based on that, which you've really succeeded at tremendously well. That's just how it is. But I'd like to take another look at the values behind it as well. We talk often and have many, well, I'd say things in common, also perhaps where we like to live or travel. You have a beautiful metaphor for what actually drives and moves you, that you shared with me recently. I think our listeners are interested in what's beneath the surface, or maybe even on the surface, probably both.
Yes, I am constantly and extremely fascinated by the sea. And the sea, I associate so many things with it. We were, as you know, on an island for 6 months last year, in Mallorca, and worked from there. That was always a dream of mine, by the way, being self-employed and able to work from anywhere. And that worked better and better. With Corona, it eventually became 100% remote, and that worked very well for us. We had a good year with Corona business-wise. And then at some point, I said the downside is a bit that I have to work from everywhere. And that's a bit of the flip side. Of course, that exists too. The vastness of the sea, the inspiration, the vision, looking forward, looking into the distance. And then, in addition, there's also the depth of the sea. Both of those things fascinate me. I like the vastness. I love the blue, the infinite. And then also the infinite depth. And that's also in connection with our work in diagnostics, where I always wanted to go deeper, without taking it too far and doing what many others do with classic assessments and additional interviews. We've kept pushing that further, as you said. My vision was to find out as accurately as possible, as well as a live assessment, maybe even better because it's objective, deep down, what makes a person tick. And to peel that back. And that's why, as you said, my vision was always to stay as focused as possible. And so I've really done exclusively diagnostics for 15 years or more now. And the new topic also emerged during that time in Mallorca. And also in the current situation, where the issue is increasingly that we can't find leaders, or we don't want just any leaders, but we realize as a company that wanting to find out deep within the company who has the potential, who is suited to take on leadership, who is suited to be developed into a different position. And that is the point that we have been working on very intensively over the last year and the year before.
Those are the dimensions of height and width, or the dimensions of depth. But you also gave me another dimension there, namely the waves, so the power and the dynamics. I found that interplay very interesting as well. And I mean, if we look at today's developments in the labor market and also in society, then you have to take that into account, and I think you naturally come to the conclusions, as you said, to dig deep and see what you have yourself. But what is this power for you? This dynamic of the waves. How can you convey that to our listeners?
Well, basically, I love waves. I love windsurfing above all, and wing foiling especially in the waves, because the wave gives an additional dimension, an extreme power. It gives a dynamic. It also demands a lot of performance, because if you don't move correctly in the wave, then you lose. If you risk too much, then it means that you're caught in the vortex. This power and performance, I think, that's where you find the analogy to the perfect fit. On the wave, everything has to fit so that it works in the end. Or even when wave riding, when surfing without a sail, you have to do many things right so that at some point, for a few seconds, you catch the wave in the right place and can ride along. So that's the performance that fascinates me, and only if everything fits does it work. And this point is also, in my observation, what makes companies truly successful in the end. When the timing is right, when the power is used exactly right, the perfect match or fit.
Yes, that's why I find the metaphor so strong. And I mean, I've also been coming from assessments for over 20 years now, and it's always about, yes, we look at the person, we look at the possibilities, the potentials, and we look at, yes, the requirements. And how do you bring that together? And when I see such images, when someone surfs the wave perfectly, then I think to myself every time, wow, yes, how can we get even better in this context? And I believe you're making a big contribution to that as well. The last aspect of the metaphor was the purity and clarity of the water, which also fascinated me. Is it something like a strive for excellence then? Or that I have all the ingredients, so it's not just about the person in the right place. At the right time. But maybe also about organizational and environmental conditions. Does that also play a role for you?
The environmental conditions are everywhere for me, especially in the wave, in the power, where the environment brings the part that we can't influence. And with clarity, with purity, when the water is clear and has a high quality, then we see. At 20 meters deep, we see the bottom. And that's what I mean by depth, the concrete, which again, in a figurative sense, is the fact-based. Making valid statements because we see very deeply. And that only works if the water is clear. Otherwise, if it's murky, when there are waves, you naturally can't see into the depths because the sand gets stirred up. When it's very shallow, that's a different moment. We're not yet on the wave in the full power dynamic, but in the analysis phase to find out. Through the highest possible specialization that we manage it under, I always say, laboratory conditions. When the water is very shallow, when everything is simple, you take the external influences away and just look into the clear, pure water. And that's what we try to do in a certain way with our online assessments, by setting the conditions. And the candidates, the test subjects, work on it in their own environment in peace so that we have a chance to look into the depths. And that's the quality through this objectivity and not through the stress level, through a person asking me a question and whether I like the person or not, that influences my answer. The calibrated and validated tools, they help a lot so that the water can be clear and we can look deep.
So we then have the good experimental conditions to actually look at it and take an analytical approach. And you've also managed to really, well, not just perfect it, I think, in the combination, but also to scale it. So I remember, you've often talked about your clients, they're really big. Companies from both the private and public sectors. And so on, so very, very interesting organizations that have been relying on you for many years for good reason. And this standardization and scaling, which also includes objectivity. In the analysis, as you just mentioned, that really fascinated me. And one could actually think, well, great, Christoph, keep scaling, more and so on, it's possible, but then, you touched on it before, and I'd like to go into it a bit more. The topic of leadership struck you a bit more and you thought, Well, because of the current market situation, but probably not only that, because the market situation shows perhaps the precariousness at the moment a bit more clearly, but isn't what you're thinking about there, when it comes to how to approach leadership and how to develop it further, actually something that, really, every company out there should be doing, and not just doing, but doing in exactly that way, with that same kind of focus and intention? And I'd be quite interested to know, in your new leadership development, which you showed me a brief glimpse of, what the core values were and how you actually went about it to break into new territory now. Break time equals 0.5s/, if you look at recruitment, especially with online assessments before you're really entering new territory. And I'd be interested to know, how did you make this journey?
Yes, I'd be happy to explain how, but for me, first the why. I've always called myself a specialist, and I've always said, I only do online assessments and nothing else. And I only do that. I like doing it the most. I'm best at it. And at some point, there was the client who kept saying, yes, but can't you help us? You know so exactly where the critical points are. Can't you offer coaching like you have? No, I don't do coaching. I used to be a coach, but I deliberately chose diagnostics. I said, we have to separate that from development. And then this question kept coming again and again. Also from the consideration or the challenge that what we do would be scalable if I hired more people who can do what I do in the interpretation and evaluation of these analyses. That's possible, but the bottleneck is really the acquisition of orders. It's difficult and it's tough, and clients sometimes forget us again. That means they have to be reminded again and again, because we don't solve any pain with our diagnostics. Because they say, I finally have a candidate, I'd rather hire them than do another analysis. It costs money again, and maybe it turns out the person isn't suitable. Come on, let's just hire them. And our top clients, our premium clients who work with us a lot, they decide, we'll do this for every recruitment. Then it's obviously good for us, then things just work. But for many, it's sporadic, especially with smaller companies that recruit for an executive position or a higher leadership role every 2 years, where they do the assessments with us. And then there was the predictability, which was always missing from this work. Sometimes there was a lot, then there was nothing at all. This up and down, I could handle that well myself, but with employees, it doesn't work so well. And so, the idea from the clients was a desire for support. And also, since you already know exactly where the critical problem areas are, then you could help us develop there. And that's when I decided to develop a leadership development program. We were able to do a pilot with one of our clients, with the company Abacus. That's an IT firm with currently almost 1,000 employees. And they wanted, well, diagnostic-based leadership development. We started there in middle management. And that worked very well. We then did pilots. We tried offering coaching based on the diagnostics. And peer coaching, that was the first idea. And from that project, the insight was that with individual coaching, about half the people loved it, the other half couldn't really relate to it. Peer coaching was liked by practically everyone. These are guided sessions with a coach, who then does a coaching session with several peers, which of course only works in larger organizations where there are peers at the same management level. And that worked very well. Plus, it promotes the culture. In the best case, they also learn to solve problems themselves through the reflecting team. Or to just ask a colleague during a coffee break. That worked great. But the wish was always, we want even more know-how, leadership know-how. Can't you tell us how others do it, or how could one specifically? And then we decided to build individual workshops as well. And we made those very specifically. Based on the topics that I know from the past with diagnostics, these topics keep coming up. And so we built workshops.
Yeah. And I think you also set it up so that you work with videos, as is common today, but you produce these things very, very well and then developed a certain format for how to master these skills, one should say, or these subject areas, and then as a leader, you also, well, empower yourself or become good at it. And that's exactly the point, despite all the individualization we have. We both come from the assessment field. Everyone is truly unique and naturally has a very specific set of development areas later on. But there is a clustering. When you have many people in a company, you eventually realize there are very specific topics. Let me pick some out. Empowerment, delegation is one. Conflict resolution is another one, of course. Communication in general, and naturally also, collaboration. And you probably built on these. Recurring fields. And you developed accordingly, if I understand you correctly.
Exactly. And we've developed a classic blended learning approach there. The idea was, as with the assessments, to achieve high effectiveness with as little effort as possible from everyone involved to get as much output as possible. And the way we work now is that the core is a workshop that lasts half a day, live on site. But before that, as preparation, there's a video with inputs, models, and theory. It's short, about 10 minutes. Then, in this customer journey, there are preparatory assignments for the workshop, all of which are played through in a system, which you know from your training. It's wonderful. After the workshop, there's another reflection assignment. How do people get into the doing? And then there's a follow-up coaching. And with one workshop, we can cover a relatively wide range and also deploy our people optimally. So these are consultants with a coaching background who lead workshops. And that's much, much more predictable and, very importantly, it's all based on diagnostics. So that's what we say, this could work. And it turns out that customers are very interested in it, and we're already starting several projects next year. Now that we're almost ready with the whole training, there's no need for selling, no need for follow-up. It's a real pain point. Many customers say we need leadership development, but we can't. We don't want to send everyone. Here in St. Gallen, we have the HSG, the University of St. Gallen. We can't put everyone into a very, very expensive, albeit good, leadership training here. Instead, we want a low-threshold offer, very, very modular, simple, and quickly accessible. That's how we developed it.
Yes, and I don't think you need a university for everything. That's why I think you have a very good, I wouldn't even call it a niche, but a large market that you're tapping into. And you've actually stayed true to your foundation. That's the diagnostics, as you say, it's based on that too. And then the model is obviously, if I understand correctly, quite flexible, with blended learning of course, but also in-person sessions. And that's the point where we might talk entrepreneur to entrepreneur. You just said it earlier, if there are fluctuations and you have permanent employees, then it gets difficult at some point. I'm familiar with that problem too. Yeah, so it has to be project-based in some way and it has to be predictable for you. And if you get such projects in leadership development, you can probably staff them well with freelancers who have the qualifications and then lead those projects. But of course, if you're being critical, and as an entrepreneur, you always have to question things, you could also say, well, isn't it maybe a new dependency that could arise, or aren't you then perhaps with these companies that are loyal to you anyway, who asked you to develop this, and you did it for them? Aren't you eventually dependent on them in a cluster-like way too? That's one question, but the other is, I can understand you very, very well, and I've gotten through this development in part too. At some point, you also want to do what you're asked to do, if you think you can. So, if you think you can help companies with leadership too, then maybe you want to do it. But of course, nothing is without risk as an entrepreneur.
Yes, and that's what makes it so exciting. That's exactly what my entrepreneurial lifeblood is. I like these challenges, and I also like it when things go well, but fundamentally also when things don't go so well, to look ahead, to look into the distance and then think about what we do next. And for me, this was a logical step now. The whole thing is called diagnostic leadership, by the way. So, it's really always diagnostics at the center and building on that. We can't go wrong at all because the diagnostics show us the issues, and it's consistently thought through, just like we do in the assessment, where we always have an onboarding conversation with our clients. And that's been tested thousands of times now. We do that when someone starts a job or even is pre-boarding for internal candidates. And we're already in leadership development there, in the support, in the guidance. And just to do that more systematically and start there, but also always with the entrepreneur or the direct supervisor on board. So that means, through the modular offering, we look with the supervisor at which courses you should attend, which workshops are of interest to you right now, what you could do in the future, or what we can postpone or leave out. It's always completely flexible. It could be that someone only takes one workshop, while someone else takes 3 or 5 workshops. And I'm sure more will be added. Some are already in the pipeline, but I think there's a bit of a trade-off there. I'd love to create 100 workshops right now, but I'm entrepreneurial and realistic enough to say, let's release these workshops to the public, and with them, of course, the consultants. We're also deliberately relying more on freelancers. So, up until now, I always had the idea of hiring people, even part-time, to enable them to work as consultants without their own client base and with a fixed workload. That didn't work too badly, but the big challenge with small workloads, as I've learned recently, is that I need people in the core team who have a large workload or their main workload at Outvision, and then work with freelancers around that. I also have someone with me, by the way, Wolfgang, who was in the first course in Switzerland when I was doing my certification. He was there with me at your place, and I've been working with him for a while now. And there, too, we're successfully bridging the gap from diagnostics to the workshops. Wolfgang also created one of the workshops on the topic of self-clarity. That's cool, of course, because we're bringing in a lot of expertise, and with people who already have a profiling values background. It's great, of course. I just had a live conversation with a consultant this week. I had an initial video call with him 2 months ago. He's also been working with profiling values for a long time, and you usually know, and you can sense it quickly in the conversation that we have.